and welcome to the Switch4Good podcast. I'm Alexandra Paul, and I'm here with my wonderful co-host, Dotsie Bausch. You so awe me that I stumbled over
Right, that's the problem that we deal with. Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone.
Dotsie, before we start with our guest today, I wanted to talk about a guest that we had a few shows back, Phil Kogan, who's the host of The Amazing Race. We got some feedback that people were upset about something that the Amazing Race had done. The Amazing Race, and that show aired, the Amazing Race show aired after we interviewed Phil Kogan, which is why we didn't bring it up. But we told the folks who contacted us that we would talk to him and discuss it. So the story is that the Amazing Race aired a show where the competitors were, part of the race was for them to get on elephants, ride elephants across a river. And Dotsie, you and I know that this is wrong. And for a lot of our listeners who are ethical vegans, this is wrong. And their argument is that the Amazing Race is promoting something that is mistreating animals. So,
because it's not just uncomfortable, I'm assuming, to be ridden. I'm not really sure. Well, we won't go there. But it's I'm being nasty.
You're
bad girl. Sorry. How they were trained to be ridden. That's the gnarly part of this. It's not just like, I mean, we don't agree with the people riding elephants, but when you peel back the layers, that's the real problem, right? Is the horrifying ways in how these elephants were trained to be ridden, with being beaten and whipped and being put into tiny boxes. You were telling me about that earlier today.
Yeah, it's called a crush box. And these little elephants are taken from their herd and their mothers, and basically their spirits are broken by putting into a small log box and beaten. And that's why they respond to voice commands. One of the competitors on Amazing Race said, "Oh, well, it's not cruel because all we're doing is telling them to walk, and they walk." Yeah, well, how they get there, how they get to that place where you just have to say walk and they walk, it's a terrible, terrible, cruel process. And just the idea of the fact that humans can use any other creature like that is wrong. So it's really, when we spoke with Phil about it, he encouraged our listeners to write to CBS and make very clear that this kind of competition and promoting this kind of activity is wrong. Now, TripAdvisor, which helps you organize your trips, will not promote any kind of activity where you ride elephants and things like that. So yay, TripAdvisor.
Yeah,
Shout
or swim
out
with
to
dolphins, right? Or anything that
exactly.
uses animal exploitation.
And so we have to make sure that CBS does the same thing and doesn't include any kind of this animal exploitation in their shows. So listeners, please go to CBS, go to the site of The Amazing Race, and write to the producers and tell them that you will not watch their show if they have any kind of animal exploitation like this, and cite specifically the April 24th show where the competitors rode the elephants.
And thank you to our listeners for speaking up.
Yeah,
on behalf.
Exactly.
Yeah, and saying something to us.
So let's go to our guest for today.
Yes,
Yeah.
we're going to, I was going to say we're going to move on to a little lighter subject, but once we dive into our guest, it's not so light.
No.
He's got a really interesting, complicated, incredible story. Most of us can barely stand an hour on the treadmill, but our guest today spent 24 hours running on one to raise awareness for one of his favorite nonprofits. This accomplishment is magnified by the fact that our guest, Joshua Stevens, isn't a typical treadmill or even road runner. He actually prefers the trails. Joshua ran his first 50K on his 44th birthday and got hooked. He's now a professional ultra runner and the 2019 Badwater Ultra Cup champion. Wow. But his road to running was certainly a rocky one. An Army vet of 24 years, Joshua ended up needing 2 spinal surgeries, which led to depression and an opioid addiction. He used his transition to a plant-based diet and his newfound love for running trails to recover not only from the surgery, but from the addiction and depression that gripped him for years. There is so much to unpack here, so let's dive in. Welcome, Joshua.
Hi, how are you?
Awesome. We're so excited to have you. Thanks for coming on, Badwater
Thank
champion.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm only slightly terrified by the power of both of you women. So I'm
we
deeply
actually are.
grateful for that.
We do have a lot of power, but as an Army vet for 24 years, I'm sure you've encountered much more terrifying things, and we actually want to go into that. But let's start from the beginning. You're living now in Colorado, but where did you grow up, and what kind of a childhood did you have?
I grew up on the coast of Maine, in mid-coast Maine. I was born in 1970 to a family of shipbuilders. And, I always find comparisons difficult. I believe that my experience is not, dramatically different from many of my peers and contemporaries. My, parents divorced when I was 8. I'm the oldest sibling of 6, and I had the same, opportunities that many folks had where I grew up, and by and large, it was a pretty idyllic lifestyle.
And then you decided to go into the Army when you got out of high school?
Yes, I would like to say that there was some kind of profound event, or I had some type of epiphany, but the truth of the matter is, I was like most 17-year-old young men who didn't really have a lot of direction or hadn't found my passion yet. And 2 of my friends from high school had enlisted, and with not a whole lot more depth of foresight and thought, I jumped in and joined them.
Well, you were there for 24 years, so it was a decision that probably suited you.
Yeah, it was a something that I never really intended, to do as a career. My family had a history of service, essentially, a blue collar family that had worked really hard and had made it in America, and we saw service as something. As something of an obligation, but it was typically a 4-year stint and then back to the private sector. For me, it, transitioned in from being, about the lowest rank you could come into the Army or any of the services as, for that matter. Then, and against all odds, moving up into the officer corps and retiring as a lieutenant colonel.
So as a 24-year Army veteran, you served in the infantry and Army Special Operations Forces and won a Purple Heart and 2 Bronze Stars. And Alexandra and I were just wowed by that. And we don't know. We should know exactly what each of one of these means. But how did you win them? What do each one of them mean? What did you do to win them? Give us some story here.
Yeah, so the Purple Heart isn't so much winning it as being awarded it for probably being the slowest guy on the team. So that came from a roadside bomb in Iraq in 2005, where I was in a vehicle, a gun truck, and we were struck directly by an improvised explosive device and was concussed and suffered my first spinal injury at that time. The Bronze Stars were more cumulative for actions in combat over extended periods of time, and I served overseas in combat, principally in Iraq and some time in Afghanistan throughout the 2000s, prior to retiring in 2014.
So you had some pretty intense injuries in the Army, and they told you that you would never be able to run again, right?
Yeah, following my second spinal surgery, Dotsie, in 2011, this really bright young neurosurgeon who'd been working with me gave me his honest assessment that the damage that I had accrued, if you will, was able to be repaired to give me, a good quality of life. But having worked in a couple of elite units in the United States Army, what I was accustomed to be able to do and took for granted, frankly, I was not going to be able to do, or would be very unlikely.
You were a runner already?
Yeah, not so much in the capacity that I am now, Alexandra. My focus was my job, which was exceedingly intensive, vis-a-vis the requirements physically. Running, strength, endurance, athletics, those are things I did for decades. It was certainly something that was important to me, but not in the way that I do it now.
Well, as Alexandra likes to mention, I like to go a little bit deep. I'm fascinated by, could you take us through that moment of the roadside bomb? Where were you? Were you on foot? Were you in a tank? How many people were with you? What were you seeing? What were you doing? Like, I don't want to experience it, but I would like to experience your story about it and what you were feeling and how, if you were frightened before. Did you know something what might happen? Things like that.
Yeah, I know. I remember it. I remember it very clearly. So I was in the back seat behind the driver in a gun truck. I believe there were 5 of us, to include the gunner, in the vehicle, and we were part of a combat patrol in a city called Beji, Iraq, which is in northern Salah ad-Din province. And Salah ad-Din province is of some note because that's the provincial capital is Tikrit. That's where Saddam Hussein and his family were from. Beji was one of, I believe at the time, only one of 3 operational oil production facilities. So it had great strategic impact, and it was highly contested. Very strong presence from Sunni rejectionists in the nascent early stages of Al Qaeda in Iraq at that time. We were on a patrol. It was quite uncommon for the unit I was in to be out during daylight. We normally did our missions at night, but it was, I recall, kind of in the morning. I don't recall specifically which. And as we were traversing this road, one of the guys on my team who was giving me the tour of this particular space, he was in the passenger seat, what they call the troop commander seat. And he looked back at me and he said, "Hey, Joshua, this is where we got blown up last week." And I looked out the window of the gun truck at what had been a previous detonation point from a roadside bomb. And sure enough, they put another one in the same space. And within a nanosecond, it had detonated and hit us on the directly up between the driver and I. And at that point, it initiated a complex ambush with other insurgents that had been laying in wait. Our vehicle was subsequently impacted in a negative way, as you can imagine. The driver lost control of the vehicle. It jerked hard to the left, and we ironically plummeted into an irrigation ditch, a reinforced irrigation ditch that was about 8 feet deep, that was being constructed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the Iraqi people. I was subsequently thrown from my seat behind the driver in between the 2 front seats, where my head struck the communication systems, and SATCOM and FM and UHF, VHF radio systems. And that's where I sustained my initial spinal injury.
And you were in several explosions over the course of your career, which ended up in 2 spinal surgeries.
Yes, ma'am. Four times.
Four explosions. You had 2 surgeries, and then what happened after your surgeries? Were you out of the Army already when you had those surgeries?
No, I was in the service at the time. The first was in the mid 2000s, and the last of which was on 2011.
Okay.
So I didn't retire until 2014.
Okay, but you read a specific book and watched a documentary in 2011 that seemed to change the trajectory of, well, your whole life. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, I think context is important, right, for anything we do. And I was not in a particularly good space. I think whether we're actors or cyclists or physicians or professional soldiers, I defined myself by my vocation. That's all I had known since I was, essentially 17 years old. And throughout this kind of series of unfortunate events with the surgeries, I had been exposed to opioids, and I'd been exposed to pain medication. And before, reading Eat and Run by Scott Jurek and seeing the movie Unbreakable, I was severely injured. I'd become, clinically depressed. I was dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, and a dependency and an addiction to opiates, as well as being, told by, a really highly respected surgeon that I probably was never going to, I wasn't going to run again. So I was definitely looking for something to radically change where I was at. And I've historically been almost a serial optimist. And if anyone who spends time with me knows, I'm generally, a good-spirited person, and that's not where I was, post 2011. So I'm not sure even how the book Eat and Run made its way into my house, but that's written by now one of my friends and legends in the ultra community, Scott Jurek, who won Western States, 7 times. He's won Hard Rock 100 and Badwater. He's a legend, and that's where I was also introduced to plant-based lifestyle, because that was his journey. And then around the same time frame, within maybe a month, this movie by this brilliant woman, J.B. Benna, came out about the Western States 100. I think it was the 2010 or 2011 running of it. And frankly, I didn't know anything about ultra running at this point. Like, running around the woods was part of my job. I didn't know you could actually do it for fun or make a vocation from it. But
now, ultra running for our listeners is anything over a marathon. Is that correct?
Yeah. Anything technically over 26.2 miles, which is a marathon. By and large, it's considered, 50 kilometers or, 31 miles or longer is generally how it's described now.
Great. So I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, no worries.
So
I think a marathon is ultra, but nobody asked me. All amazing. Wow.
So you were recovering from your second surgery. You were really, really depressed. You'd been addicted to opioids for several years, since mid-2000, so maybe 5 years.
Yeah, about that time length. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you saw these movies. You saw this movie and you read this book. Tell us how it grabbed you.
Well, first was the book, and that's one of the things that's one of the reasons I feel so privileged to be able to work with Switch4Good is running is in and of itself unimportant to me, outside of the context of, did it change my lifestyle for the better? Did it make me a better man? Did it make me a father? And the plant-based component in Eat and Run may have been more important because it was the catalyst for my healing journey. Going dairy-free was the first test that I gave myself after reading that book. And I didn't like where I was at. I didn't like who I'd become, and I needed a radical change. So that book really gave me a blueprint for how to get back to where I wanted to be and how to, grow into who I wanted to be as well. And so I can't, for those folks who don't know who Scott Jurek is, I would encourage you to go look it up. He's now, he's in Boulder, Colorado. He and I are great friends. But I owe him a debt of gratitude for that book, because that started the journey to where I am today. And I don't know that it's hyperbole to say that it probably saved my life.
Before we go into this extraordinary success story, I want to go back to the depression and the addiction. How bad did it get? What was the rock bottom? How much were you taking? I want to really understand the depths of the agony and what mind space you were in back then.
Well, in terms of volume of narcotics that I would consume, I would liken it to my ability to endure and suffer as an ultra runner. I have a high capacity for punishing myself, and that is something that it definitely bore itself out with the number of opioids that I consumed, really over about a 6-year period. And there were a couple of points of relapse in the ensuing years, but a really 6-year heavy period of usage. And one of the great things about the Department of Defense as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq drew on was the amount of resources and a level of focus they threw into starting to understand the differences between post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, depression. We tend to lump those in a lot. I don't know how depressed was I? Well, I considered suicide many times. I was extremely unhappy. Now, I don't know how to parse that out to say what part of that was neurological damage from direct exposure to roadside bombs, what part of that was, genetically predisposed, what part of that came from the synthesizing and processing of witnessing lots of horrific things. I can say I was very, very unhappy. I was a very, very unhappy man, and I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone.
You also were addicted to something which can also make you more depressed, even though you're trying to numb the pain.
Change your brain chemistry.
Yeah.
Right. You both hit it on the head. That's the one thing that gets me really fired up today when we see the struggles to hold big pharma accountable for, frankly, what's come out in a number of federal lawsuits, absolutely dishonest business practices. Mm-hmm. The capacity of opioids to change and alter, sometimes irrevocably, your brain chemistry cannot be understated. So through therapy for a number of years, I began to suss out what behaviors or what feelings may have been attached to to what experiences. But yeah, one of the reasons that opioids, I believe, have such a death grip in contemporary society is, and looking back at my own recovery, was that it numbs your emotional pain. It's a quick way to not feel anything. And so while I started taking them for severe physical pain, I now, in retrospect, look back and fully understand a lot of it is I just didn't want to feel anything anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, how were you getting them? Obviously, besides the big pharma, we also have an issue with the medical professionals that are providing way too much to patients who are long past their surgeries and their healing,
sure.
Their physical healing.
Right. Yeah, what I'd like to say is, I think, in my case, and we're all prisoners of our own experience. Mm-hmm. I had extraordinary medical practitioners. I had some of the best medical practitioners, the most ethical folks that you could ever want. You got to keep in mind where my dependency started was really the mid 2000s, and that's the high watermark for when big pharma was. And again, this is all borne out in federal lawsuits. They were providing absolutely bogus studies to general practitioners. I don't believe that anyone intended or through malfeasance were prescribing me doses of medication in some nefarious way or due to a lack of intellect. I think we were all doing what it was taking at the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts to keep people like me in the game. And as a professional and a very serious business unit, I was on a a team of 4. We couldn't afford to not have me deploy. And so I own as much responsibility as the folks that were working with me, is that we were going to do whatever it took to stay in the game. What I never knew was, as a really straight edge guy, I'd never had a narcotic before I'd had a painkiller at 37. I didn't know how quickly I could become dependent.
And in the 50s, the doctors were sort of told to withhold pain meds from people because they were afraid of getting folks addicted. And then sometime, I think it was the 70s, it became considered cruel to do that. And that doctors started trusting their patients with what they said about their pain threshold. And so it was really the norm in the medical industry to listen to the patient. If the patient said they had pain, then give them painkillers. And it was a lot in part because the companies were lying about how addictive these substances are.
So your doctors, who were quite upstanding, read these studies and it was like, oh, this isn't addictive. It's okay. He needs this to get through the next deployment, the next, whatever it might be, the next battle. And that's,
but how did you get, so if you're addicted and you're out in the field, is it easy to get those drugs because you just say you're in pain and they say, okay? Is that how you did it?
Well, I think generally what would happen is, working in a non-traditional field where, it wasn't a 9-to-5 job where, I could swing by the CVS at the end of the day. You would get amounts of medications based on how long, you'd be deployed for. It really varied, over 6 years, how how many and how frequently I got them changed based on, the tolerance that I'd built up. And, it's difficult to, it was always, and this is the lie we tell ourselves if you become addicted to these drugs, via legal means, is, well, I can't be wrong because I'm getting it from a doctor. I'm getting it from several doctors. They're telling me that I need them, and it's not until afterwards, if you're fortunate and if you're as lucky as me to come out on the other side and not go down. It's a bifurcated path, and if you could continue to take that down, to a point where we're at right now. In my opinion, the reason that the Mexican drug cartels are so prolific is we set conditions in the United States for this to happen. If you get large portions of your population addicted and dependent on these drugs, and then without really understanding withdrawal, without really understanding addiction, DEA, the FDA, and these folks come in and they start shutting these doctors down, addicts aren't just going to stop. They're going to go find other methods for getting those drugs. And as a society, to not own our responsibility for the situation we have with the proliferation of Mexican cartels operating in the U.S., and that if you shut down addicts' resources through physicians, by and large, most of them are going to go seek that drug somewhere else. And so fentanyl and other opioid derivatives that have come in in large part because of the conditions we've created ourselves here in the U.S.
So it's harder to get it by legal means, so now we're going to the streets.
Where it's cheaper. And because if you've not been an addict, or you're not going through recovery, it's not that you're not empathetic or you don't understand, but it's being addicted to opioids, or really anything from my layman's perspective, isn't a moral choice. You didn't wake up and say, well, my doctor's not going to give me Percocet anymore, I guess I'll just stop using it. That's a really reductive understanding of addiction. And, again, this binary choice that we discuss now politically, as if it's a push-pull, that below the southern border, all this stuff is being pushed up into the United States. It's being pushed up because there was a demand signal created, frankly, by people like me. in tens of millions of other Americans. And again, I think we need to own that.
You did quit, and didn't you do it in a quite an unorthodox, but maybe not surprising considering your years in the Army way? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. And again, I think we've made great progress in the U.S., and I know the Department of Defense has. But at the point where I knew that I needed to make a change, I did not feel like there were a number of viable resources for me. I was highly ashamed of where I'd gotten. It would have been highly detrimental to my career. To bring this up as an issue, or I felt like it was at that time. So I locked myself in the guest room and basically quit cold turkey after 6 years in a not very pleasant week of time.
Took you 7 days. And did your family know that you were going through this all this time, or did you keep it a secret from everyone?
Yeah, it was by and large a secret. I think more people, particularly after I started talking about it, were aware that there was something wrong, right? I mean, it's all good until it's not, and then I think when people look in retrospect, the signs were there. But in terms of making it public that I was going through this, even with closest friends and family, no, it was something I did on my own.
So I feel like for me that exercise staves off demons for me. I think you've used the word demon yourself, and maybe a lot of us who have, Dotsie also dealt with addiction, especially sadness or depression. I feel like part of me thinks if I don't exercise, I might fall into that abyss again. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if running is something that you're doing to stave off those feelings, but in a healthy way. So are you dealing with your feelings more than you were when you were an opioid addict, or is running helping you avoid them again?
Now, that's one of the best questions anyone's ever asked me. I think this sounds contrived, but you have to be running towards something, not running away from something. And I think it has to be done in conjunction with a number of other activities, be it therapy, healthy living, surrounding yourself with a positive circle of people that lift you up. So running is fundamental to my growth and existence.
So do you feel, to answer my question, you feel like you are still dealing with your pain, but running helps you deal with it? Is that what I'm hearing? Or maybe you don't have pain, because what I find is that because my life is so good now, I kind of just was able to skip over a lot of that. I don't have to sit in it and go over it and stuff. So maybe you're just able to skip over it.
I think I'm in a really good spot and have been for a while, and I'm tremendously happy and grateful. I think that running plays a key component in my mental and emotional and spiritual health. But unlike when I first started running, when I first, rejected this idea that I would never be able to run again, my motivation is dramatically different. So at first, this first 2 and 3 mile slogs around my neighborhood in North Carolina when I was trying to fix so many parts of my life, that was definitely a healing salve to, really to kind of dampen my sadness and depression. Where now it's, some years later, I'm getting ready to run as soon as we get done with this. I mean, I can't wait to get out here in the mountains and run in the space that I live in. So I think it can be all things to everyone, but running to me now is simply defined as joy.
That's beautiful. You've said that you found a kind of a moral compass through a new way of eating, not consuming animals. Right. And it sounds like that just kind of has perpetuated and kept alive your passion because of this moral compass that you are driven by on a daily basis. I think for those of us that lean into plants and don't consume animals or animal products, this is the key difference between any other quote diet, right? Whether it's keto or gluten-free or Atkins, and we get really frustrated when people lump us in with like the diet, because the morality and just the daily decision to lean away from terror and lean into kindness and love changes you. It still changes me every single day, every single minute that I make those choices. I want to hear so much about that journey for you, because it's a continued journey, right? Like for all of us, it never stops. It's never like, okay, it's over today and I'm, the same. You have gone through a transformation.
What's especially interesting to me too, to just echo what Dotsie's saying, is that you came from 24 years where you were supposed to, well, war is about harming the other side. And now you're about not harming. And I'm wondering if there's any penance there, or there's anything that's tied in with that.
Wow.
Okay, that's a lot. Sorry.
I know. I love it. And these are things that I love to talk about. And I think that not only was I in a very traditional organization for 24 years, I grew up in a very traditional community in New England. I think when we uncover and foster and nurture our empathy, we find that it's always been there. It's that we're conditioned, in such a way that I think my path to, and I hate to use this term because, if I were Rich Roll, I'd feel more comfortable saying enlightenment, but I'm still a Philistine. But I think that it was always there, but ignorance prevents us in terms of our nutrition and consumerism, and the way that we divorce this idea of eating at a restaurant and really understanding the symbiotic relationship from consumerism to where that food came from. And for me, like a lot of Americans and a lot of folks in developed Western nations, we grew up, I grew up loving animals, loving cats and dogs, but being completely ignorant as to consuming meat and dairy. And that, path, thank goodness it happened to me. Maybe it's not just penance for my time in the service, it's just penance or me finally paying rent for being able to live on this planet and caring for all of God's creatures. And if you ascribe to a theological bend, I think there's so many layers to that I haven't even figured out about myself. All I know is that I feel like a much better tenant on planet Earth since I've made this choice and gone down this path.
Is it when you say that, is that about the environmental impacts, or is it about the nonviolence impact? What's
both. I think I'd heard another podcast with John Joseph. I think maybe he was on Rich. We were talking about the kind of Buddhist idea that when you consume meat or dairy products, you're consuming the energy that came from how that was harvested. Mm-hmm. So that's a kind of spiritual bent. If you want to take it from a scientific or a environmental piece, let's look at dairy, where the largest percentage of GMO products consumed are by farm animals, and the largest portion of that is for dairy cows. So there's so many different ways that we can reach out to people who are interested in finding out about a plant-based lifestyle or dairy-free lifestyle. Whether it's because of ethical and moral issues, or because they're unhealthy and they're not happy with where they're at. We're armed with so many great tools in what you two are doing. Not to invoke hyperbole, but I think it's life-changing. And over time, you look at the progress we've made promoting this lifestyle, I know far more people today than I did a decade ago that adhere to a dairy-free and a plant-based lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. So when you became dairy-free, did you lock yourself in a guest room for 7 days and become plant-based? Is that what you did too, or how was your transition?
Sweating it out.
Like a sweat lodge. No, that was different. That was and Dotsie can definitely appreciate this. That was my kind of my athletic competitive nature. Was I believed what I was starting to see in terms of research and in terms of listening to people I respected, that hell, I wasn't just going to run again. My goal was to compete at a high level. And I'm going to tell you, when you're in your early 40s and you've had 2 neck surgeries, there weren't a whole lot of people in my camp that thought that was going to happen. But the dairy-free piece was the first step on my path to a plant-based lifestyle. And it was such a cataclysmic for me, and a lot of people may be able to relate to this. Given my background and given my dependency on, it wasn't just opiates. I was taking Ambien. I was doing all sorts of stuff to, just to have some quality of life. But sleep had always been a really big problem for me. And that was the first thing. That's when the light switch went on, where I said, "There's something to this."
You mean because your sleep got better? Your sleep got better?
Yeah, I started. Yeah, absolutely. Oh. Like I didn't need to take anything to sleep, and that was huge. And then the cardiovascular health benefits. As an endurance long distance runner, inflammation is a huge problem set. And all of those things began to resolve in terms of negative issues that were going on. And then I began to see and feel the benefits of not consuming dairy products. And that was, that really got the ball rolling and increased momentum exponentially for me as an athlete.
Why dairy? Why did you take that out before chicken or whatever it might be?
Yeah, Eat and Run, the Scott Jurek book, and then that kind of led me to, I think Rich's book is called Finding Ultra. Mm-hmm. That followed shortly thereafter, and we're all incentivized differently. And for me, it was initially getting healthy and getting fit again, and that was the catalyst for the dairy, removing dairy, and I think. Over time, then the grassroots morality that I grew up with in terms of wanting to treat animals in an ethical way, that just strengthened my resolve.
Wow. And so you became plant-based. Did it improve your running, or did you start doing ultras at the same time as you became plant-based?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because it wasn't a linear path. The dairy part was for me, but I went the way that a lot of folks do. From a pescatarian to a vegetarian and back, and over kind of a 2 or 3 year period until I became completely plant-based. And it's I would like to say that I did it with, inculcating it with scientific methodology. My experiences are my own anecdotal observations. But certainly as I became more serious, and certainly as I became more successful as a professional runner, I saw the direct, not corollary, but the causal impacts of plant-based with enhanced performance and reduced susceptibility to injuries.
So in a couple of years ago, this is amazing. I mentioned it when I introduced you, so we've got to talk about this. You ran on a treadmill for 24 hours, 24 straight hours, right. I'm assuming, right, to raise money for the Heron Project, which is a nonprofit to help those with opioid.
Who wouldn't want to do that?
Yeah, well, but I mean, what it was for was to help those with opioid addiction. So you obviously had a big heart to drive it home in your craziness that you even could be able to do that in the first place. But it was fueled by compassion for people that are struggling as you were. So what did you do that? Were you in your house or were you with a lot of other people that were doing the same thing? Or tell us about this.
That was hosted by the Boulder Running Company in Boulder, Colorado. And we had done kind of like a beta test the year before where, it was a little more low key, and it was a number of ambassadors for a heroin project across the country. And I should have learned that, right? I ran 100 miles, and I was like, this is pretty awful.
He was on the treadmill for 18 hours, not 24, just 18.
Yeah, just 18 hours, right? And the next year, as is wont to happen with athletes, someone with a good idea calls you right after you've had an amazing workout. You feel great. You just had an amazing segment. It's been a strong week, and they could ask you to do anything. That's what happened to me. Okay, well, 24 hours on a bigger stage, and so we set it up and had just tremendous outpouring of support from the community. In Boulder, in this area, we have such a high density of former national champions and Olympians and professional world-class athletes. So one of my heroes, two-time Olympian Kara Goucher, came with her husband and son, Scott Jurek, and a heap of other professional athletes. And then just the community across the full spectrum, from hobby joggers to other pros. And we kept the store open for the entire time. I had a backup treadmill next to me, so if the primary one went down, I could jump over to the next one, or people could just come in and run next to me, which I can assure you, I was a real treat to be around, 2, 3, and 4 in the morning.
Oh man! But you were the only one running. There wasn't anyone else doing this with you to rate. I mean,
no, it was just me.
Oh
just
my
me.
gosh! What's going on, Scott? He wouldn't get on there with you for at least 5 hours or something.
I know.
That's
I mean,
right.
I think everyone liked to come and just my friends just come and laugh at me. But we ended up doing about 121 miles and raised a bunch of money and awareness, and knew the media from Denver and some other places came up and covered it. But, I was just the guy on the treadmill. It was the support system around me. And if anyone's not familiar with Heron Project, Chris Heron, former NBA player from back in New England like me, he's just an extraordinary guy. And his journey is sorry, there's my cat popping in. One of them.
Hello, kitty.
Been around there?
Yeah.
That's Olive, my rescue kitty.
Hi,
So, Chris, just to promote something real quick, because I think it's going to be on ABC, and they just had it on ESPN. He did a new documentary called First Day, where Chris goes and does outreach to schools across America to talk about their journeys, turning the conversation away from what we went through and trying to reach kids prior to becoming addicted.
That's wonderful that he's talking about it, because you mentioned shame, which is a big silencer. And so just by somebody like Chris and you talking about these men who are strong and physically strong, but you're showing that you have emotional vulnerabilities. And that's really important.
You ladies are doing the same thing. And I think, if anything, you're both stronger than I am. And
oh no!
Whatever small part I can do. But the treadmill thing was to support Chris and what his organization does. It was an honor to do that. Who knows? Maybe you guys can convince me to do it again at some point.
Well, we'll come cheer you on.
Yeah. Glad you told us about the project.
I'm gonna hold you to that.
Before we go, I want to ask, what would you say to someone who is depressed or struggling to get their life together, or especially dealing with an addiction of prescription drugs? Is there any advice that you have or anything that you can share with them that might help them get to the other side?
Reach out, read, and forgive yourself. I think if there's anything that I've learned is, first of all, I'm always uncomfortable getting into comparative analysis about who has suffered more trauma and or who's had harder experiences. I can't tell you how many times I've had this conversation where someone says, well, I haven't gone through anything nearly as awful as you have. And you both know that's not how addiction works. That's not how body image issues work. We are in a society where trauma and susceptibility to things like substance use disorder, body image issues, cutting, any number of things that manifest themselves in how we hurt ourselves are universal. So don't be afraid to share your pain with somebody. You may be surprised at how many of us there are and how willing we are to support one another. And my journey is still ongoing. And I would like to, running for me is important. And this may seem non-tangential, but I'd like to throw out this book called What Made Maddie Run, about a young woman who killed herself at the University of Pennsylvania. She was I have an 18-year-old daughter, and trying to understand the depth and breadth of pain in our society is deeply important to me. But I never figured that out, ladies, until I humbled myself enough to ask for help. And that's, it doesn't sound profound or seminal, but talk to someone. That's the first path. That's the first step on the path to healing.
Because your pain is real. If you have pain, it's real.
Yeah.
Right. We can't. How do we measure it? Right. It's real.
It's
It exists.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on our show, Joshua. We really appreciate it.
You are so good. It blew me away. Yeah, just brilliant.
I am. I am so impressed and in awe of you two and the folks, like I said, that you've had on this before. It's truly a privilege and an honor, and this means a lot to me.
We have loved every second.
Thank you so much.
Truly.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switch4good.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to Switch for Good. This is the future.